evening. I'm Jim Wygant for the Video Access Project. Our guest is Merritt Linn, author of the Book of Songs. And this is a new novel, a first novel by a Portland ophthalmologist, a story of prisoners of war in a prison camp. And without any further explanation, Merritt, tell me, how did you happen to write this as your first novel?
Well, I think one thinks about these things for many, many years, and it was just kind of a spontaneous thing. I went out and bought some paper and a pen and pencil and just started in. I had the desire to write something about the many holocausts that occur throughout the world. I wanted to make this a rather universal story. I've always felt that the Jews are interested in their Holocaust, the Indians and theirs. I wanted to write something that would have a broad appeal, something that anyone reading the book would be able to identify with and gain some feel for what people have gone through.
You wrote a book that is easily identifiable, I think, as representative of the Holocaust experience. And yet it is a book that nowhere in it specifically mentions Jews or Jewish culture. There are some Jewish names, and that's about the closest to it. I understand that that was a deliberate way of writing on your part.
Very much so. I did not want to write another book about a specific event. I wanted the reader to not know for sure exactly where was this or who were the people. I wanted the reader to think, well, could this be me? Could this happen to me? That's why it's somewhat allegorical.
I'd say it's very allegorical. It's a fascinating story, and there's a beautiful economy of style, as I mentioned to you earlier, that leaves us with a real sense of mystery about who some of these people are. We don't know much about them, and we never really learn much about them. In some cases, we never know their names. We only know them by the nicknames that they're known in this camp. How did you decide how much to tell about these people, and how well do you feel you knew or do know the characters that you wrote about?
Well, it's interesting. You create them. I had no experience in writing before, and I thought this was one of the most fascinating things. You could create characters that you know everything about, the author does, but some, I don't even understand them fully myself, a lot of their motivations. And this came as a surprise to me. You would think that what you create, you know from A to Z, but you don't.
Some authors, I think, are inclined to create an entire fictional biography of a character before they even begin writing a book. I sense that you did not do that deliberately.
A lot of the characters came up spontaneously. I did not have to say, well, I'm going to create a character today. They would pop up, and I could just sit back and in many ways let the story write itself. I could think about this character, and then something would pop into my mind as to what he was doing. And that was fun. It was like returning to childhood.
This is a very heavy book. I would almost say dreary, in the sense that it's very heavy reading. These people are in a very grave experience. And I was fascinated in reading the book with the element of faith that seems to pervade the entire book. The characters have varying degrees of faith. Some of them seem to have very strong faith, which sometimes is not characterized as really the way to be. Others of them seem to be people of almost no faith at all, and one particular character, the poet, who was a very cynical person whom we might say possibly was faithless. He's one who escapes early in the book. Tell me about the character of the poet and what to you he represents in contrast to the other characters.
Most of the other characters, or all of the other characters, stayed in the camp for one reason or another and endured all the hardship. The poet, after a while, would have none of this, and he was going to get out. And I regard him as a very positive character. He is somebody who will not endure. I mean, I think 98% of the world endures many things that they do not like. This man wouldn't. He was going to get out of there, and he did. I think a great deal of this character. He wasn't going to put up with it.
There are characters in the book who are depicted as having the kinds of traditional senses of righteousness or dignity, which under the circumstances that they were in, sometimes don't seem to be the right position to take. If we're going to consider, first of all, do you consider this camp that you've created a microcosm of anything else? And if so, what?
The world. Living, life. I wrote it on a number of different levels. And some of the levels I am not even quite sure, where they are. But it's life, the choices that one has to make. I think the camp was kind of a cauldron. Things were more extreme. One had to make more major choices of life and death, whereas, in our daily lives, it's not that extreme. But it's a takeoff, in a way, on living and the choices of how one lives and all that.
It was interesting also that the villains in the book, the guards, were always a little bit in the background. Unlike other books about prison camps, they were not always present. They were not always villainous. They were not always the kind of people that you could hate. In greatest part, they seem to be almost indifferent to the prisoners. Why was that? Why did you depict them that way?
Because I feel that one of the things that I really feel strongly is that, okay, the guards were indifferent, they were bored, they regarded the prisoners as subhuman, and I regard this as really a great danger. If one group regards another group as subhuman, the chance of a Holocaust is there. Or if we regard, great mischief and horror can come if we do not regard other groups as on a par with us. And that I wanted to get across. I also wanted to get across that these were ordinary people, the guards. And there was some goodness in them and, some evil. I was trying to play goodness and evil, beauty and ugliness back and forth, which I think exists in the world.
You had a fascinating symbol. Well, I'm not going to call him a symbol because he ran throughout the book and he's one of the main characters, and that's a small boy with a violin. The title of the book is Book of Songs, and there are musical references throughout the book. The workshop where these men work on making useless items, or even worse than useless, items of death, which are items of shrapnel. In that workshop, they are referred to as the orchestra, and the machines that they work at create a kind of a symphonic sound of sorts. Why all the musical references?
I can't say for sure, but here again, I do know that it is playing the beauty of music right next to the horror and ugliness of making things for war. A great deal of the book, or a lot of the book, was composed when my wife and I went to the Portland Symphony. And she would be listening to the symphony, and my mind would immediately go off into the book.
The music seemed to represent a sense of hope in the book. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. To me, music and the violin, which plays a large part in the book, to me, what comes out of a violin, to me, I think is, magnificent, very godlike, the highest thing that a man can create. And I wanted it there, to have the both the evil and the beauty.
In reading the book, I thought it really was a perfect balance all the way through, and that it had what I really felt was an appropriate ending. And yet, I know that the ending that was published was not the one that you wrote. Tell me about that.
Well, the publisher bought the book with the original ending, the first ending, and well, I will tell you the ending.
Don't tell us.
I won't
don't
tell you
us the published ending. Tell us the one that didn't get published.
All right. The original ending was where the man who brings this child, who is somewhat of like an animal, he humanizes the child, and at the end, they are separated. The publisher really did not want this because they felt that after going through this book, the reader deserves something better than the child and the man, the narrator, separating. And the publisher wanted the boy and the man to walk off together. And this was something that I really could not abide with. And the book very nearly was not published until we worked out a compromise.
Are you satisfied with the ending as it is?
I think so, yes. Yes. But I could not have the man walking hand in hand into the sunset, with the boy. But the editor felt that the reader deserved something good out of reading through 309 pages. And I did want to end on a note of hope, and I originally felt that I did with the first ending.
This is a book in which it is sometimes very difficult to determine where loyalties lie. At times it seems that the prisoners themselves are reinforcing their own imprisonment. And one of the big images that runs throughout the book is them working in this workshop. Did you have in mind a specific prisoner of war camp scene when you wrote the workshop part, or were you thinking more in terms of people today working in factories?
I think I was thinking in many ways of today. I think, so many of us can spend their day just pounding out, the same thing without a great deal of meaning. And in the story in the book, it was just heightened. It was heightened.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had a number of desires in the book. One to portray life, one to portray the Holocaust, to experiment. I think many times an author does not know the full meaning of what he or she has written until later, and perhaps never.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that you accomplished what you set out to do, or did you really have it that clearly planned out when you began it? This book took you, 6 years?
No, about 3 years.
3 years to write. And over those 3 years, or at the end of those 3 years, did you end up where you thought you were going to be when you started?
When I started, I really didn't know how it would end or if I would finish it. And then I found during the writing of the book that the characters in the book became far more fascinating than the usual life that I led. And one could have two lives. And I had to be very careful to separate my regular life from the 1 hour a night that I was writing. Mm-hmm. The book got far further than I ever dreamt.
You're a kind of a merciless author because you develop some characters for whom I think readers can develop a great deal of affection or interest. And then you do clever things with them. A character who is predominant early in the book is the philosopher, Shalene. And initially, the reader's impression of that character is that he is a man of almost some kind of vision, and that he represents a great deal of hope to the other prisoners, that they come and talk to him, and he is a means of providing them with some sense of human dignity. What happens to that man?
All right, he is one of the characters that I created. When I say created, I think you borrow from numerous sources. But in borrowing this man from numerous sources, I don't quite understand him totally. He gave them hope. But I think that this man realized that he made them like sniveling children. They came to him for everything, asking him when should they eat their food, if they should change from one machine to the other. He wanted to give them some sense of dignity in this horror. And then he finds that he has not done that. And he commits suicide. And he does it, I had him do it in a manner such that they would not revere him. Mm-hmm. He did it in a very negative way. He ate his own food and then kills himself a few seconds later. He could have given this food to these starving men. I wanted him to feel that he was not doing anything good for them, and he killed himself just so that they could not use him as a false symbol.
The narrator of the book is someone whom, for whom a reader, I suppose, must have very ambivalent feelings throughout the book, because his nature does seem so human. At times, he seems weak and indecisive. At other times, he seems to do just the right thing. And as the book progresses, his character moves more towards that of another character, which is the character called the Red Cap, who is a prisoner who is very, very pushy with the other prisoners, and in fact, in a sense, almost takes the role of a guard. How did you happen to develop the narrator's character in that direction, that kind of forceful character?
I wanted the reader to identify with the narrator. I didn't want to make him a saint, because there are very few saints who would read my book. I wanted to show how he was captured by Shalim, the philosopher, and how his life was pretty much decimated. And then meaning comes to his life by humanizing this mongrel child. And he gained strength. I feel that, we are all, for the most part, masters of our own destiny. And this narrator becomes the master of his destiny. He goes from a passive way of life to a very active way of life.
And it's a very painful experience for him.
Yes.
In the process, he kills a man.
That is right.
The book is fascinating in the way it deals with violence, because these people are in a constantly violent circumstance. People are being killed or are dying constantly around them. And there is an almost cavalier attitude with regard to death. I remember, again, a scene early in the book where a man in a truck being taken to the camp, this is very early in the book, virtually invites a guard to shoot him, and the guard does. And that's about all there is that's said about it. It's not dramatized, it's just simply that it happened. And repeatedly later on in the book, that same circumstance happens. Probably the only scene involving death or violence that really is dramatized is the scene in which the narrator kills that one man. And it's almost a gruesome scene, and yet very appropriate in terms of what you were trying to describe, I thought. How did you make a decision on how to handle violence? Violence is such an easy thing to do so wrong. It's for some people it's very attractive, and for some people they think it's going to sell books, and they really like to write grisly scenes. Yet your violent scenes are they seem to me fairly tame and almost matter of fact. Does that come from the fact that you have medical training?
Maybe. I don't know. I don't like violence. And I know so many books on Holocaust, they show one picture after another of piled up bodies. And I didn't want to write a book like that, because I think a human gets turned off. After a while, you see so much violence, the reader cannot absorb anymore. He's satiated. I didn't want that. I think I made a conscious decision even before I wrote it, I think, not to really get into graphic detail. I didn't want that.
It was almost as though the reader was sharing the sense of numbness that the prisoners themselves felt toward violence. As a reader, I've sort of imagined that, yes, this must have been the regard that they had for violence, having become so accustomed to it. Do you see the book as one that projects a sense of hope, or one that projects a sense of despair?
No, hope. I would never write anything and leave anyone, just, I always say, in the mud. There has to be some hope, or else I wouldn't take the time to write it. But the subject of Holocausts, it's very hard to get any hope out of it, and I think this book has some shred of hope in the figure of the child. I regard a child as hope.
You're a Portland ophthalmologist. This was your first book, not just your first book published, but the first thing that you had written.
Yes.
How hard was it to get it published?
It was, I was very fortunate. I took the manuscript and sent it to a number of different publishers and was rejected. And I later found out that you've got to match the book with the publishing house and with the individual in the publishing house. So if you just shotgun a manuscript, you're going to, for the most part, get knocked down. I found people in publishing to be, extremely nice. I would call them and say, would you look at my manuscript? And they'd say yes, and I think a good many of them did. I was very fortunate to have a book distributor. I won't mention her name because everyone will send her manuscript, but she was most helpful to me. She liked the manuscript and gave me the name of an agent in New York. And the agent liked the manuscript, and the agent was able to, it's like a marriage or a matchmaker. Mm-hmm. She was able to take the manuscript and find individuals in certain publishing houses who she knew would like it or might like it, and this is what happened.
How many publishers had you tried on yourself before?
About 10.
About 10.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, or do you feel that if you had continued trying that you might have succeeded on your own?
Well, after the 10th, I said to myself, I don't think my book is good enough, but I said, I really felt that if a book is good enough, if you keep sending it, it may take many, many years, but you will find somebody who will publish it. I think if it's good enough. I felt mine wasn't good enough, but I felt that they gave me a pretty darn good audience, very good audience.
Turned out it was good enough. You're in second printing now, and paperback will be out sometime soon.
In the fall.
And maybe someday they'll make a movie out of it. Who knows?
Who knows?
You're working on, you've already started another book.
Yes.
What's that going to be about?
What has fascinated me is the black experience in this country. How, there's the American dream, the Norman Rockwell American dream. I don't know if every white American has it, but I think a great many people shoot for it. I don't know how a black handles this. And it deals with this. And obviously it's from a white perspective. Mm-hmm. But it's interested me how a lot of minorities will fight for this country, give their blood for this country, but through most of the history of this country, they haven't been able to fully enjoy, what is etched in stone as to what this country means.
The theme sounds in some ways possibly similar to a book of songs, if we're going to say that the theme represents the contrast of an individual against a society or within a society and the problems in dealing with it. Of course, in the prison camp, the society is a very small one, but it still represents a kind of a society. You're talking about something on a little larger scale now.
Well, I have to be careful because they say that every author tends to write the same book again, so we'll see.
Well, I think I was trying to think of the name of the author in Chicago who, one of my favorite authors, who's written, I think, the same book probably a dozen times, and a couple of them have won National Book Awards. So Saul Bellow is who I was trying to think of. So maybe that's not a bad thing to do. If you have an important message, find different ways to say it.
I don't know I think if I found that I was writing the same one again, I'd quit. But we'll see.
Your technique is, and I'm not really all that interested in getting into exactly how you write, but you did tell me that you longhand your books, which seems like an arduous process to me.
Well, that's because
typing.
I don't know how to type.
Don't know how to type.
In high school, I peaked, when I was supposed to be looking at the copy, and that didn't work.
So the entire manuscript for a book of songs was all handwritten out?
At least 3 or 4 times.
Okay. That's a remarkable process, I think. I myself type everything and sometimes find that very tiresome, but if I had to handwrite an entire manuscript, I'm not sure I would ever be able to finish it. You were working, I assume, while you wrote this book. Did you write in evenings or mornings? Or?
I would write like from 11 to 12 at night. And as I said, I had to separate my regular life from the writing life. That was most important.
Having lived with this book now for at least 3 years and finally seen it published, it has been reviewed very favorably, and not just by local press, but New York Times as well. How do you feel about it? Now, what do you think about your own book?
Well, you become detached from it. It has a life of its own. It's like a child. I'm very pleased with it, but it has its own life. I don't even feel many times that I'm part of it. It's a strange process. I've gone on to, this other thought of another book, and the people that are in Book of Songs they're there. I don't even know where all of them are.
How did you happen to call it Book of Songs? It's almost Book of Psalms. Was that another?
There was a poem by Marc Chagall talking about the Holocaust, and he was talking about books never written and songs never sung. That's where the songs came from. My daughter, who at the time was writing, she was 6, and was writing and drawing little works called the Book of Holidays, the Book of Colors. So I said, well, I'll put the two together. So that became Book of Songs. And I was quite sure the publisher would change it, because the title Book of Songs really doesn't tell what the book is about. And lo and behold, the jacket came through one day and they had kept it.
That's unusual, I think. Publishers frequently change titles.
Well, they probably figured we had so much problems with the ending. They said, we don't want to go through that with him on the on the title.
Did you set out in mind with all the musical references, or did that just come naturally?
So much of it just came. So much of it came. I had a beginning and I had an ending, but it developed. I could just sit back and just let things go. That fascinated me, that I was able to do that.
How long do you expect your current book to take? As long as the last one?
I would expect so, because I would just be spending like an hour a night on it.
You don't plan on abandoning your medical practice to
No.
become a full-time author?
No.
Do you see yourself now as an author or as an ophthalmologist?
I would say basically an ophthalmologist, but, well, many times I don't know where I am. It's difficult. But I think a book runs its course, and I think it'll vary.
I don't mean to ask you an impertinent question, but what made you think that you could write a book? You told me that you'd never written anything until you wrote this.
I didn't think I could. I just started, and it went on, and I was positive it would never be published. Totally positive. I got a great deal of encouragement from my wife, and I was very shocked when people would read the manuscript and like it. I was amazed.
Do you think you were initially really writing it for your own edification?
It was spontaneous. I really felt a need to write. I really did. I don't know why then, but I had to. I really wanted to.
You've never taken any creative writing classes? Or?
No. No, I think that's what makes the thought of another book more difficult, because I know of a number of the errors that I made. I can tell people that you do not need to know how to spell, and you don't need grammar. I think if the publisher thinks you have a good story, they hire people who spell for you, and with a blue pencil they do this and that.
Well, Merritt Linn, it has been a great pleasure speaking with you. We have been talking with Merritt Linn, the author of the Book of Songs, which is a book that was published in September.
Yes.
Is already in second printing and has been very favorably reviewed. And my personal recommendation goes with it as well. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and for the Video Access Project, I'm Jim Wygant.